Hello and welcome to Money Tips. This is Charles Kelly. Today I want to give you some urgent news and updates for all landlords and buy-to-let investors in the UK. Now, we've heard already about the government's intention to abolish Section 21 no-fault evictions, and it was put forward as a possible, they're consulting on it and that sort of thing. So you might think, well, it's not really going to happen, but the National Landlords Association, I was at one of their meetings the other day, said that the government really wants to push this through. And this has been further confirmed during a speech by Prime Minister Theresa May at the Housing 2019 conference on the 26th of June. Now, I'm taking this from landlordsadvice.co.uk, and they've quoted the speech here, and I think you'll be quite surprised by the tone of it. Now, the Prime Minister said, "We are rebalancing the relationship between the tenant and landlord, making major changes that will have an immediate and lasting impact on the lives of millions of families." Sorry about that, Teresa. I had to do that little accent. Okay, I'll stop the accent now. Okay. And she said here, in the private sector, we've already capped the size of rent deposits. This is coming from the 1st of June, the Right to Rent Act that I've talked about in another podcast. Look it up if you don't know it. They've capped the size of the deposits and abolished let-in fees. Okay, cutting the amounts. Now listen to this. Cutting the amounts tenants have to find up front and making it, and I quote, harder for landlords and agents to take advantage of desperate house hunters. This is the mood I'm getting here from this speech. Do you hear that? Making it harder for landlords and agents to take advantage of desperate house hunters. Now, you might think some of these fees are unfair, but I think, in order to get a reference on somebody and find out whether they're trustworthy or not, because we know that not all tenants are trustworthy, and there's little a landlord can do when a tenant runs off without paying the rent, and they're the ones breaking the tenancy agreement, but I don't see the council, coming down on them. So you can see where I'm coming from here. I'm a landlord, and, I find some of these things coming out, they're like, a series of punches that are coming like in a boxing match. First you had the uppercut to the belly, which said that, they're taking away tax relief, under Section 24, they're taking away tax relief and are phasing that out for landlords. So in any other business, you have a business loan to buy something, you get tax relief against the profits or the turnover. So they're taking that away. Then there's another punch around the kidneys there with taking away wear and tear allowance. And now this is coming in. It's like a knee to the groin. This is not just boxing. This is all in wrestling and no rules cage fighting. This is a knee to the groin, and it's really going to hit landlords. So, and you can see by the tone of it, making it harder for landlords and agents to take advantage of desperate house hunters. But what about the good landlords and the good letting agents that do things up, properly and above board, and people know what they're getting into? But that's not enough. She says, now we're going further, because if you rent a property, it will not be your house, but it will be your home. And that means if you pay rent and play by the rules and keep the house in good order, your landlord should not be allowed to throw you out on a whim. It is simply not fair. It's simply not fair that the landlord could throw you out on a whim. There you go. So we are bringing an end to the practice of the so-called no-fault evictions and repealing Section 21 of the 1988 Housing Act. Now, that is pretty clear here. It's simply not fair. Now, why is it called an eviction? That's what I don't understand. If you've reached an end of a tenancy agreement, you say, I want to rent this house out to you for a year, and then at the end of that year, that's the end of the contract. Why do you need an eviction notice or a no-fault eviction notice to get your house back? It's your house or your apartment. And I've never understood this. And I talked to a letting agent about it, and they always make a point of serving a Section 21 because the tenant might change their mind. And then what do you do? If you're expecting to get your house back, so you're moving back into it, or you've got another person wants to rent it, or you just want to sell it, what would you do then if the tenant said, well, I can't find anything now, I've decided to stay on a bit longer, I've been to the council, and they say you have to serve a Section 21 notice, so there. And believe me, I've seen this happen, and I don't see why we need a reason. And under previous notices I've seen that they might bring in some form of section in replacement for the section 21. They might say, well, landlords will get their house back if for certain reasons, like they're going to move into it. But I don't see why we should have to give a reason for wanting the house back when the tenancy agreement has already ended. So watch out for that one. And a consultation on the changes will be published, and with a view to introducing the legislation later this year. So why they're doing a consultation, I don't know. They're obviously not intending to listen to any of the answers in the consultation. And if it's anything like consultations I've seen, they're pretty loaded questions, making you tell them what they want to hear, in other words. So it looks like this is coming in. Obviously, Theresa May won't be Prime Minister in about a month's time. But this is not just her. This is a department that's pushing this through, and a minister. So I would expect to see this through. But to me, they haven't thought this through. They haven't really fully thought this through and think, well, how is it, and think about how it's going to work. Now, I'll just read on here from the notices. The government will now shortly launch a consultation on the proposed repeal of Section 21 of the Housing Act 1988, in which landlords may have the opportunity to give their views to the government on this major proposed change. Now, they haven't really listened to landlords in the past. I think landlords are an easy prey. There's not much sympathy for landlords. Look at what's gone on in the last couple of years. Plus, we've got a lot of local authorities bringing in blanket selective licensing. And the public generally are against landlords. They think landlords are causing homelessness, which I know is not true. I mean, I saw figures from my local authority, and landlords was not the top reason why people become homeless. It's family breakups, it's all sorts of things. But landlords are up there, but they call it landlord eviction. But it might not be an eviction as such. It's just somebody saying, well, I want the house back. Where you have rent arrears and you have problems with a tenant, that's called a Section 8 eviction. And the National Landlords Association said that the average cost of imposing those Section 8 evictions is around £5,000 and can take 5 or 6 months. So in that time, the tenant's probably not paying you. So all of this is not good news for the private sector. And you'd think that they didn't want us. Well, in fact, a previous housing minister told me just that. He said, we don't want mom and pop landlords. We would rather have the corporates. We want the corporates, not the mom and pop landlords. We want the big companies, corporates. And that's why the corporates can get tax relief on a loan because they're borrowing it in the limited company name rather than Mr. Mom and Pop landlord who gets it in his own name. And now the tax relief has been taken away. It's like pulling the rug from under their feet. And I really just don't understand this. It's a Conservative government. You think the Conservative government would want to look after people like investors, buy-to-let investors. They're going out there, they're trying to create some wealth for themselves, they're trying to create a pension for themselves rather than sort of relying on the state or benefits. And it now seems that they're getting this knee in the groin and the punch in the pelvis and the little dig round the back in the kidney. So I just don't understand it. It means now that if they just take away the Section 21, landlords would only be able to rely on grounds for repossession of their property set out in Schedule 2 of the 1988 Housing Act, which is commonly known as the Section 8 eviction procedure. Now, there's a quote here from Sasser Charles of the Landlords Advice UK, who said, this will be draconian legislation to repeal Section 21. Landlords have already lost the security to let out their property in the private sector following much legislation which has been acted over the past 4 years, which has brought more red tape for landlords. Landlords need the security to let the property, and that security is knowing that if they need possession of the property, they could obtain possession even if the tenant was not in breach of the terms of their tenancy. And I think what they've said here is landlords are paying the price for the government's endless failure to address the real cause of evictions in the private sector, which is rent arrears. And some of this has come about through housing benefit not being paid on time, etc. The current legislation needs to be reassessed and reformed. However, repealing Section 21 for the possession grounds is is not only a step further in the words of the Prime Minister rather than perhaps a step too far. So what we'd urge you to do if you're a landlord is go on, look for this consultation. You can find it when it comes out on the website of the NLA, because we don't want to go back to the bad old days when, in the 60s and 70s and the 50s, following, the Rackman era of terrible landlords, the slum landlords, the government went too far and gave people absolute security. And, you had a situation where you couldn't get rid of a tenant and the rent was fixed for life almost. And, they were called a sit-in tenant. And up until recently, you could still buy properties with a sit-in tenant in situ. So if you had this sit-in tenant in a house, say in Paddington, the house would be sold at a substantial discount, maybe at auction, because there's a tenant in one room, and that is then not a vacant possession. And then the owners would then have to negotiate with the tenant to go, and perhaps give them a lot of money, or just wait until they die. And most of these sit-in tenants have probably died off now. I don't think there's that many left, because they would relate from way back. And so we don't want to get into that situation. And of course, then property owners stopped renting out property. They said, well, this is not good. We're not going to do this. And it was only when they started introducing new legislation and the assured short-hold tenancies and buy-to-let mortgages, in the 90s, that the market for this took off. So there are properties available. And if you get rid of all the small landlords, where are people going to go? The government have not built any substantial amounts of social and council housing since, from what I can see, the 1970s. And they seem to, councils don't want to do it, because I was in a council meeting, says, why don't you build more council houses? You can borrow money cheaply from government sources. You've got money sitting there. You've got community infrastructure levy. You've got all sorts of things you could use, and Section 106 money to build council houses. They said, no, we don't want to do that because people might buy them in the future under a right to buy. What? You're worried about housing somebody in a council house because somebody then might buy it. Well, to me, it seems that that person would still be in a house. They would still have somewhere to live, and you've done your job as a council. But no, they still won't do it. I know what they're saying is that they would then lose that house under the right to buy scheme. But in reality, around the London area, it's unlikely that someone who would qualify to become a council tenant would have sufficient income to buy that council house when it's selling for £500,000, £600,000 and £700,000 on the market, even with a discount, because the discount is capped anyway. So even with a discount, they would not be able to afford it. In fact, there was news on released today that said that in London, that the amount of money a person would need to earn in London in order to buy a property is, how much would you say? 30, 40, 50,000? No, £84,000. And that's because to get a mortgage to buy the average house, they would need that much income in order to borrow enough to buy that house on a mortgage. Obviously, they could buy cash, but if they need a mortgage, we assume most people need a mortgage, that they would need that much income. Okay, so that's my kind of rant about this. I urge you to get onto these consultations, to lobby your MP and say, look, what the hell is going on? You're clamping down, you're trampling on people that are entrepreneurial, that go out and start businesses, because buy-to-let is a business. It's not just a hobby. And you're pulling the rug from under their feet, and not only that, but you're spoiling some people's plans for retirement. The government, successive governments, have already messed up the pension system. So a lot of people thought, well, buy-to-let is something that is tangible, something I can see, something I can borrow to buy. And they've worked out a plan of action over the years, and it's very wrong of the government to just change that midstream and say, no, that's not what we're going to do now. We've changed our mind. We're pulling that from you. So that's my rant on that. Now, I wanted to mention something else that's come up in the Financial Times, and it's saying here that the German house market has turned into what they call an Alice in Wonderland. The yield on a 5-year bond issued by mortgage banks slid to minus 0.2%, and comparing to a level of 5% a decade ago. This means that investors are essentially paying for the privilege of lending money to Europe's largest property sector, and and it seems to have turned logic on its head. If that was not bizarre enough, consider this: in Denmark, some financial institutions are offering borrowers negative mortgages that pay interest. And you think, what? Negative mortgages that pay you interest. So you borrow money, you get a property, and they pay you interest. I don't get that. Now you might think, great, low interest rates, who cares? But we did see this in Japan a few years ago, and it put Japan into a 20-year recession, if you like. And there is, and this is the point I wanted to make really. One obvious reason to pay attention is that sinking bond yields and inverted yield, what they call an inverted yield curve, where short-term bonds have a higher yield than long-term bonds. Now, normally you'd expect to get a higher rate on a long term than a short term. So when short-term bonds have higher yields than a long-term bond, this has previously been a good predictor of a recession coming. So that's why I wanted to mention that. When we talk about bonds and gilts, it's quite high finance, but when you break it down to that, when the market's like that, it could lead to recession, and this has been warned by other financial commentators as well. So watch out for that one. If you want to go and buy in Denmark, you might get a negative interest mortgage. So good luck to you on that. So that's all for now. I'm still angry about this Section 21 and the words of the outgoing Prime Minister. It just really sort of makes my blood boil. But what can I do? The best thing to do about it is to write your MP and lobby. So thanks very much. This has been Charles Kelly, bringing you money tips to help you save, earn, invest and accumulate more money.